Nice. Cool. Welcome, everybody. Today is the 11th of January, and this is Indexer Office Hours number 45. Today's agenda has been posted in the Office Hours chat in Discord, so please find it there and you can follow along. If anyone's new to Indexer Office Hours, please do participate. You can either request to join the stage if you'd like to join by voice, or you can ask questions in the Office Hours chat channel. Today, we're going to chat about a few different things, starting with some of the changes in Indexer Agent and what that has meant for the network. And then we're also going to talk about, in open discussion, the lack of cost model investments in the network from indexers today and why that might be and how we can change that. But before we get to that, let's start off with Repo Watch. So we've expanded, by the way, the agenda slightly to include more information. So you can follow along more closely there. Beginning with Geth, we had a release 1.10.15. If anybody is running Geth, please do upgrade ASAP. That is quite an important upgrade because 0.12, 13, and 14 all suffer from a P2P bug. So definitely upgrade there. Otherwise, it doesn't look like any significant changes were made in that release. We have nothing new from Aragon or Open Ethereum. And as for streaming fast instrumented Geth, we had a DeepMind release of Geth 1.10.15, which is targeted at Ethereum mainnet, and otherwise no new releases for BSC or Polygon. Moving on to the Graph stack, no new release of Graph nodes. The last one was 0.25.0. But there are three pretty interesting pull requests, one of which is merged and the other two look close to merge. A few sessions ago, we spoke to Ottavio from EdgeNode about some of the performance improvements that are coming to GraphNode. And we got three of these PRs listed in the agenda. So parallel receipt fetching, stream pipeline, so presumably that's blockstream pipelining, and David from EdgeNode has also begun work on pipelining store operations, which should also be a very significant performance uplift when that lands. And store operations, if that's not clear, is operations that GraphNode does against Postgres. So yeah, check out those pull requests if you're interested. Onto Indexer Service and Agent, we have had no new releases from the last release, 0.18.6, which was actually made, I think, live in the last IOH by Ford. Yay. But we will talk a bit more about Indexer Service and that release later on in today's session. Pull request-wise, there are a few pull requests that look quite interesting. I just pulled two out. The first is, shamelessly a pull request that I submitted, but I'm sure everyone will be happy to know that batched voucher redemptions are coming to Indexer Agents soon. And particularly given that today, batched rebate claims depend on the vouchers for those allocations having been redeemed. Batching the voucher redemptions will be a big gas unlock, for that step, but also for the downstream rebate claim batch step as well. Happy to talk more about that in the open discussion segment. The other very cool pull request to see is 350 from Hope at Figment. And I haven't looked very closely at it, but from what I can tell, it moves off-chain subgraphs from a static command line argument to a kind of formal part of the workflow where we can actually use the GraphQL API that Indexer Agent exposes, or Indexer CLI and the rules subcommand to manage off-chain subgraphs, or in other words, to index subgraphs without allocating to them. I know that's been a huge frustration for me, having to restart the process each time that list changes. So this is a huge quality of life improvement for indexes, and a big thank you to Hope. I don't know if she's here. Oh yeah, hey. Your volume is very low, Hope. Can't hear you.
That's pretty useful, and I'm having some trouble with the GraphQL stuff, but if anyone can help out.
Yeah, I saw the error message you dropped in the GitHub pull request. So yeah, we can talk about that later. And yeah, if anybody else wants to have a look at that and try and help, please do. It's pull request 350. As for the rest of the stack, nothing noteworthy. So I think that covers Repo Watch. On to Protocol Watch. I'll hand over to Juan.
Yep, so it's going to be a brief one. From the contract side, there's no new updates on the PRs since the last Indexer office hours. Same goes for the forum research section, no new updates. There is a small update on the forum governance. There's a small update on GIP 22, which is the tendered mint indexing for the graph node. I think Jack Sampling added some new information. He seems to be quite knowledgeable about Cosmos and everything related to Tendermint. So he had a few new ideas and new tools that we can use, and maybe expand on that. So, and that's about it. On Protocol Watch, there's not that much to talk about, unfortunately.
There are busy weeks and slow weeks. I dropped the link to the GIP that Juan was talking about into the chat. Does anyone have questions on Repo Watch or Protocol Watch before we move on? Anyone have positive or negative node upgrade experiences or anything like that?
18.6 was pretty easy for bare metal people. No need to upgrade Rust or NPM or Go or anything like that. Just was a pretty simple upgrade for anyone that uses bare metal.
Yeah, I used the Docker image here, and that upgrade was pretty seamless. But I actually, a slight segue, I know that a few of us have had issues trying to compile, or rather trying to build Indexer Agent on Mac M1 machines. I know that Ford had done some work towards that, but I haven't been able to test that yet. Ford, can you comment on that, or?
Yeah, sure. So I merged a PR, I believe, last week where I upgraded a lot of the dependencies in Indexer Agent. The overall goal of that was to get to a point where you could use Node version 16, which is more compatible with M1 Macs, and also specifically updating the library that we use to compile Rust projects with Node plugins. So we use that for the cost model project. And that was having trouble with M1 Max and with older versions of Node, so like version 14, version 12. Now that I've upgraded all those dependencies, the CI tests that were failing are working, and some of the I've had some users on M1 test it, and it seems to be working. So I would love it if more people could test. That PR is not on the latest release yet, but I'm hoping to put out another release this week that includes all those updates.
Awesome. Great to hear. Thanks, Ford. Yeah, I've got that PR open, so I'll give that a try and let you know how it goes. Cool. So before we move on to topics in focus, a quick plug to the latest episodes of GRT IQ. So since last week, we've had episodes 45 and 46 come out, and they provide comprehensive coverage of the best of 2021. So if you haven't religiously listened to all of the episodes, they're a great shot at getting some of the best insights and taking it in the best way. Cool. So on to topics in focus. I thought today that we could start with indexer agents' new defaults, and specifically I'm talking about the defaults for the rebate claim batching. And the two defaults are in question are the rebate claim threshold and the rebate claim batch threshold. Maybe just to set some context, so prior to the 0.18.6 release, there was no batching of rebate claims, and so there was the allocation claim threshold parameter, which I believe was used for rebate claims as well. And so, whatever you set this parameter to would be the minimum amount of GRT that a single rebate claim would need to be worth in order for your agent to go ahead and make that claim. With batching, we now have these two parameters. You still have the allocation, the rebate claim threshold, which works similarly to the way the old ARG worked. Specifically, it defines the minimum value of a single rebate in GRT in order for it to be included in a batched claim. And the reason you might want to specify a minimum is if you have a rebate for 0.1 GRT, even if you're batching that claim together with, hundreds of other rebate claims, the marginal increase in gas cost associated with that claim will always be worth more than the value of the rebate in GRT. So there are some claims that you would just never want to, some rebates you would never want to claim. So that's what the first parameter is for. And the second parameter, which is the rebate claim batch threshold, is the value of all rebates in a batch, obviously respecting the first rule. Let me start that again. It is the threshold at which the value of all of the rebates in a batch are claimed. And that's obviously done as one batched transaction. Okay, hopefully you guys followed along. I didn't totally mess that up. The reason we're talking about this is the defaults for these two flags, which are respectively, I think 200 and 2000 GRT, have currently meant that almost no indexers have actually gone ahead and claimed any rebates. Maybe now's the time to hand over to Ford. Ford, I hope that was an okay introduction. Maybe you could explain why this could be problematic for us and why we need to think about it.
Yeah, so if you go to the decentralized network explorer, the data that is shown for a proxy for query volume are the query fees that have been redeemed on the network. This is, not a direct data on the query volume, but this is as far as the decentralized explorer and feeding from subgraph data, this is kind of what we have on the network is query fee data. So in the current case where we have these high thresholds for claiming and redeeming, and because of those, almost no indexers are actually redeeming, the data that is showing for network-wide queries is flatlining. So it looks like the network isn't processing query fees if a user comes in with a naive perspective and sees that. So we kind of have this interesting situation where as indexers, you want to optimize your value and you want to, try to batch things up and wait until there's enough value accrued that it makes sense for you to claim and redeem those vouchers. But for the health of the network, especially in this phase that we're in, where we're trying to bring in more subgraphs, we're trying to do rapid growth on the network, I think it's really important that there's this view into the network queries, and people can see that the query volume is growing and want to jump in there. So we have this kind of public goods of data there. So as indexers, there's not a direct incentive to claim and redeem those, but for your reputation and for the network, it's useful for delegators and for curators and for subgraph developers to see that query volume on the network. So yeah, that kind of states the problem that we're in. And maybe that can kick off some discussion.
So when I'm hearing this talk of actually needing to sign a transaction to redeem, my mind immediately goes to the reason why people don't want to redeem is a cost, right? There's no incentive. So if we could reduce that harm in any way, that's a worthwhile direction to think in. And I mean, one really low-hanging fruit would just be some sort of tool that can kick off a query redemption, maybe not based on a threshold of your payload, but on like a network gas. At that time, you could have it due Sunday at 3 a.m. EST, because that's a common time. You could look at Jim's sheet. I know, Jim, you have that nice colorful sheet of gas fees and how they change.
We already have something that approximates that. So you can already specify acceptable gas conditions for any indexer transaction. And so effectively, once the batch threshold is met, your agent will wait as long as it takes for those conditions to be met before posting the transaction.
Gotcha. And that's just like a constant that you kind of set?
Yeah, there are a couple flags that you can pass into the agent to configure those parameters.
And that brings up a point that I think it would be useful, and I've been meaning to for a while, to write up a more detailed like tutorial or guide on how to use the transaction management. So for instance, that minimum gas threshold is one that I don't think many indexers are using, but as Chris stated, you can use that to make your indexer agent wait until there are favorable gas prices before it sends any transactions at all. And then, so part of the problem we got into is that we were trying to optimize gas efficiency here. So we're batching these transactions, but because of that, the agent may wait for a while until it has enough in there to send that batch transaction. So we've kind of introduced this delay to the redeem. And as far as gas efficiency, that's wonderful. But for the data integrity on the network, it's leaving gaps there, as indexer agents are, kind of sitting around waiting for there to be enough value accrued in their vouchers to send that transaction.
The definition of the problem helps clear it up. Thanks.
One thing that I've also noticed too is that with the current cut percentages that indexers have set, it's going to make it tougher and tougher to reach those limits where it is a little bit more profitable, especially if we're, on subgraphs that have lots of indexers on them. If someone who has a query cut percent at 10%, they're going to be probably waiting for an allocation that's over 1,000 GRT in order to claim those. So that's one thing that I've been looking at kind of from the curation side of, is it worthwhile to start adjusting those, at least in the current state?
Not sure what you're getting. Which cut are you talking about there, Derek?
Not the indexer reward cut, but the query fee cut.
Right, but that doesn't affect the decision of the agent's decision. Like it's the gross query fee that the decision is being made on, right? The total bucket that is going to be redeemed via the vouchers. It's not just the indexer looking at their own cut. Obviously, we should be thinking about that, right? But I don't think that quite equates into the decision-making process. I think we might be looking at this from the wrong angle, because ultimately we can twiddle knobs endlessly to try and create these models that will efficiently claim these transactions, but if you look at the mechanics of the network and you just like look at this from a real cold, factual point of view, the issue is twofold. Number one, there's not enough query traffic on the network to, with the current cost models, cover the costs of the gas. And the second part, and the one that I think we really do need to, we all need to take an honest look at this, and maybe those who have been working on it, if they have, start sharing or at least putting some little bits of information out there. We need to look at cost modeling, because ideally, any indexer that's doing their job correctly would be modeling the queries on every subgraph individually based on a number of factors that would include the number of indexers and a projection on how many queries they would be getting for that subgraph. Then they would be setting their prices such that their costs are covered, right? Now, we know that's very difficult to do, but we also know that, you know, most people are just setting flat cost models at the moment. I know I am. I think part of the problem here is that maybe we're all setting mostly flat cost models across all subgraphs. And what we really need to do is actually assess costs based on individual subgraphs and working out the market for each subgraph. Then you have a query price that will actually cover the costs that you have to endure. I feel like that's potentially something we should be looking at to solve this problem, not only looking at how the agent behaves.
Definitely agree there. But I do, you know, to kind of reframe again, I do think that Ford touched on an important angle here, and that is, I mean, as much as, you know, query fees and the query fee market and cost models and all of that stuff is supposed to be a manifestation of, you know, rational free market activity, like that doesn't reconcile so much with the fact that today, you know, as much as like Ford was saying, like, okay, you know, we've got this new mechanism that is targeting increased economic efficiency for indexers. I think if you flip that recognition on its head, what you also see is that up until this point, indexers have been effectively subsidizing the cost of delivering query volume to the network, right? Like the net cost of propagating that data onto the blockchain exceeds the value that indexers have received in return. And that may be okay, right? Like we may kind of all look at that as a public good, and like the net kind of non-financial benefit of that activity may work for us, but it doesn't, you know, there is like a juxtaposition there with like the completely rational actor free market model of things. And we got to reconcile those two.
It's an interesting dynamic when you say subsidizing. So what would be interesting to think about is that a function of the indexer rewards being sufficient enough to sustain indexer operations that you don't have to focus on query fees today? Or is it truly the intent wanting to subsidize? I think going back to Jim's point is that based on the volume that there has been so far, there's just been not enough incentive to really go to the query fee cost modeling and optimize for that.
Personally, sorry, Oliver.
Yeah, go ahead.
So as much as I agree with Jim, and, you know, I mean, one of the points of other points of open discussion for today's IOH was the lack of cost models in the network. So it's definitely related. Personally, though, I think that, you know, cost and price are two completely different things. And I think that like cost models are useful as a means of like modeling the varied cost basis of executing any given query, you know, whether that's bandwidth, computational resource, whatever. But the cost model should, in my opinion, kind of on a more fundamental basis, really just be like there needs to be some price anchor, right? The cost model allows you to say, well, this query is more expensive than this query, but you still need some baseline notion of price. And I think
that's what I was talking about, Chris.
Yeah,
that's what I was talking about. The
yeah, but I don't think
right?
that's cost model. Like I in the sense that I don't think that an Agora model.
Yeah, prices. You're right. You're absolutely right.
Yes.
What I'm referring to is actually price modeling. It's not cost modeling. I totally agree. There's a complete distinction between the two, and that's how business works. That's how margin works, right? You're absolutely right. What I'm really talking about is price. At the end of the day, how do we actually culminate price based on all of the factors and the expenses and the costs? One thing I would add as well is that there's probably some difference of opinion between indexers on how important it is to be claiming all of these vouchers now, right? For example, I find it quite important to claim them, but even at today's prices, gas prices, I'm not really willing to drop my threshold, below cost at this point. But there are those out there that are making such a large, they've got such a large margin that they can just afford to claim those, transactions. So the smaller stake you have, the less opportunity you have to do that, and the more it costs you to get your query fee optics on the network correct.
100%. I think, for smaller indexers, you're essentially, in order for them to maintain optics, you're asking them to burn their query revenues.
Yeah. Or more, beyond burning it.
On the topic of subsidization, I wonder if there's some way we could make use of the fact that we already have presumably full nodes or archive nodes running in a network of nodes to query, that you could have some sort of extensions by which people could query the archive node and pay for that. Infura charges $250 a month.
Sorry, how does that relate to gas prices?
I think he's talking about adding another revenue stream for indexers.
On the topic of subsidization of the indexer's income.
Got it. So, there are solutions. There's stuff out there like Pocket Network, right? Which is, RPC as a service. There are many other income streams that indexers can tap into, but nothing else within the protocol today. Changing the model is super complex.
Another thing this whole problem in a lot of ways is a bootstrapping problem, right? Because we have low query fees and relatively low query volume. And so, the incentive to redeem those is low. I think one of the things I wanted to express in this office hours is that I think it is valuable for indexers to put this data out there for their own business in terms of growth, so that I think it's going to be important to bring in more subgraphs and more users. So, I don't think there's an easy way to integrate it into the economics right now. At EduNode, we're trying to brainstorm better ways to display this data, so you guys aren't on the hook for essentially subsidizing the data. But I do want to communicate that I think it is beneficial for your businesses in this sort of chicken and egg problem to try to get the query volume out there to then attract more business.
Yeah, because being able to deliver one query versus being able to stake some, I think it was Zach that said this. In fact, I heard it. He said it on GRTIQ, and I heard it again in that recap in the last two recap episodes. But he said the leap from being able to stake GRT and get delegations from leaping from there to actually delivering a query is a massive jump. And when he's making a delegation decision, that's number one for him. Have they managed to settle one GRT on the network? So I imagine that also plays very much into reputation as well with the gateway, if that's what Zach's saying. But it's like I said before, it's difficult once you hit some certain lower threshold of stake to make that decision. Say, yeah, I'll invest that, or I'll burn that ether to get the optics on the dashboard. And prior to that point, it's all just sitting in the contracts, right? It's sitting in the smart contracts. There's nothing on chain up until the point of where you redeem your vouchers.
Yeah, so the gateway and you as the indexer and your payment channel, have that source of truth of how many queries and what the costs were. But in order for that to get on chain, it has to be collected and then redeemed.
So moving forward, I think, there are a number of changes on the horizon that make this problem less significant. I fully agree with Ford in his comment that this is a bootstrapping problem. And that manifests in today where larger indexers don't have this problem because they're able to meet the batch thresholds and smaller ones aren't. So if we had a significantly larger volume of queries hitting the decentralized network and each individual indexer generated significantly more query fees, that would lessen the issue significantly. We have many billions of queries a day hitting the hosted service. So that demand exists. It's just a matter of it migrating. The other thing to say to Pineapple's point is, cost reductions are coming in the form of L2. And those, will be very significant and also, lessen the significance of this issue. In the shorter term, I feel like there's a question of, is it okay, are we okay to ride the problem out and kind of rely on the goodwill of some indexers? And, I'm somewhat reminded of the conversation we had in our last indexer office hours relating to public goods and the difficulty of depending on goodwill. But it might be that we think we can ride that out. Alternatively, and I know that there's sensitivity around this and I understand it, but EdgeNode obviously operates the gateways today, and by virtue of operating the gateways and facilitating payment receipts and everything else, they already have kind of comprehensive query volume and fee data. Obviously, if this data was leveraged in the Explorer products, there might be sensitivity about that versus getting it on chain. But yeah, that option theoretically exists. I don't know whether it's on the table, but I'm keen to get perspectives on that too.
Sorry, could you restate that option? Another set of data to display?
Yeah, so if in the decentralized Explorer, query volumes for a subgraph or fee volumes, for example, were sourced from the gateways as a source of truth as opposed to on-chain redemptions, that.
Yeah, that would be nice as far as the data itself. I believe the goal of the decentralized Explorer is to not use any proprietary centralized data sets. So, one thing we're brainstorming is can we use a cheap L2 to start pushing that data into an L2 and then use a subgraph to power that? Or, how can we do this in a fully decentralized way? So, maybe EdgeNode ends up hosting a separate site that has some of the data from, components that EdgeNode hosts. But as the gateway is technically external to the decentralized protocol, the Explorer is intended to only show data from the decentralized protocol.
That makes sense. I think I'd be keen to get opinions from anyone who's willing to share. In my view, I feel like if EdgeNode were to launch an independent product that displayed this data from the gateways, it wouldn't necessarily compromise the kind of decentralized vision of the decentralized Explorer, but it might provide, critical information to other participants in the network, right? As indexers, we see the queries coming in. We know we've got the receipts in the DB, but others don't have that visibility. And so as a stopgap, while we kind of push through this bootstrapping phase and also get the cost benefits of L2 in time, maybe it would be worth doing something like that.
Yeah, a dashboard with the context of it being a bootstrapping dashboard could potentially work.
Yeah, I could easily see, a huge benefit across the network for many participants to have that access to that data for sure. I'll definitely try to advocate for that within ENN.
And on the topic of information, any information that really helps people start indexing is really useful, right? Because that's just very beneficial to the bootstrapping phase. Like personally, I would find that information very, very useful for talking in the initial beginning phases of where we're at right now. It would help those plannings a lot, even if it's just basic information.
Okay.
Maybe one final just clarification, because the term public good has come up a number of times, especially in the context of last week's discussion as well. I'm in the understanding, and I'm curious to hear everyone else's thought. Public good to me would be a consciously supported subgraph behind which we have an application where we feel this is a dApp that works for the greater good. They don't have the fees, and we are going to support that with maybe up to 0 query fees, which is different from what we're having here, where we have rewards that indexers just don't want to claim because it's cost prohibitive to them, right? So people feel differently about that.
I feel like the framing is a little different. I'm thinking just about the data itself, and in order to get that data out there, indexers essentially have to pay money. So it's a public goods data that is subsidized and somewhat by indexers.
And there's certainly an argument to be made, as you hinted at, Ford, that propagating that information into the ecosystem is net beneficial, even if it's kind of not economically viable in that single transaction.
It's almost, if you're thinking of analogies, it's like priming the pumps, right? So you're having to prime the pumps in order to get the process going in the first place, which is what we're doing right now, right? We're trying to kickstart the network. And we're seeing a lot of problems that don't, we know that the modeling in the steady state shows that these things will work when the business is there. But in the early days, a lot of the model sort of breaks down because we don't have, for example, in this case, we don't have the volume or we don't have the pricing correct, something like that, and that's where priming the pumps or priming the fuel lines, whatever, is kind of something that we need to consider doing in order to, sort of kick things off.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah, especially I feel like in this particular moment is one where a lot of people are excited about using the network, and I think there's a feeling of not being sure exactly when it's ready for their specific use case. So right now, like as much as possible, I'm trying to figure out ways to get signal out there that other developers using similar use cases as them are having positive experiences, query fees are flowing through the network, and just start to push the dominoes and start to get them to fall and move on to the network.
Yeah, I'm wondering if we can add to the story really, Ford, because I wouldn't really expect Edge and Node to be doing it, because Edge and Node, obviously, you do have access to the data on the gateways. You can tell, where the business is, what the stories about business are. And, we had one of those, which was around Juicebox. And the story of the Constitution DAO. And I was one of the indexers on that, and this query fees just went through the roof. The queries per second went through the roof. It was really cool to watch. Just to see my business actually providing a service, it was amazing. I feel like that we need more of that. We need indexers to start talking about the dynamics they see in the subgraph they're supporting, right? I feel like, and this is just my own opinion, right? But I feel like there's this unspoken desire amongst indexers to keep the data to yourself. If you found a subgraph where there's a lot of business, then maybe you want to keep quiet about it. But I think actually, if we started sharing, on IOH a bit about what we are seeing in the network in terms of QPS on various subgraphs, that can help to start building some of these stories that we've already seen for Juicebox as an example. And I think indexers doing that rather than Edge and Node doing that is probably the right way to do it. It's maybe
Cool.
something you consider, Chris, for a section later on down the line.
Yeah, I was about to say, a new segment in IOH.
I mean, I'd be happy to share my dashboard and show people what's going on my. It's not very interesting, for most people, but I think Index would be interested to see, the service dashboards that for everyone else, and ask questions about, oh, what was that spike in traffic? What subgraph was that on? Is there a story to be told there? I think that also helps with the developer story.
That'd be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, that can also help, I think, have a knock-on effects where, one thing we're seeing is that subgraph developers are deploying and they have maybe 500 GRT in signal or something. And, they really need curators to amplify that signal for it to then be picked up effectively by indexers. So the more we can, put out information about dApps that are going to be using the network and, getting more signal on them and having those signals be more effective, the better and more healthy we're gonna have the network be. So yeah, I would definitely appreciate indexers, sharing more of your stories of in the trenches, dealing with high traffic or new dApps or whatever it is that you are actually dealing with.
One thought on that, we also have the curation station public, right? We could have that there and actually have the curators too make promotions for individual subgraph that they have vetted, and the value that they see in them really communicate it out to the indexer community proactively. So have sort of like both angles covered, and might relieve the indexer office hours that's typically busy on the agenda. Maybe move that to a curation station call that happens every other week.
Good ideas. Yeah, I've taken note of this. I definitely think it would be a worthwhile segment or just generally a worthwhile activity to be sharing. So, yeah, you heard it here. We'll get something to you. Perhaps just to round up this one. So, as we touched on at the beginning of the discussion, the default parameters across those two arguments are 200 and 2000 GRT respectively. So a single rebate claim costs about 120,000 gas. In a batch of 100 claims, which is quite a lot, and maybe for more context, that would be 100 allocations. You can get the individual claim cost to be about 50,000 gas. So it's a bit over 50% reduction in gas in a large batch. What do we want to revise these default arguments to? Today, if I did a kind of quick napkin math earlier, and in the kind of best possible circumstances, so if you are claiming a rebate in a very large batch, and with ETH priced as it is today, the kind of single cost of that claim within a batch would be about $15. So given the price of GRT, the kind of break-even threshold would be, if we assume GRT is 50 cents, roughly 30 GRT. So as you can see, the defaults build in a fair amount of buffer, but obviously the idea here is that you claim these rebates and at least make some profit. With a kind of view that we want to support the propagation of this data on chain, do we want to modify the defaults, and do we want to target some level of minimum profitability for the claim, or should we leave them as they are? How are people thinking about it?
Yeah, it's a complex one, to be honest, Chris. Compared to the previous threshold we had, which was a very easy thing to sort of model in your head, this is a bit different. Like, I mean, you've just provided some numbers there. So you said about 30 GRT per allocation.
Yeah, so at least that would only hold. So if we say, if you wanted to break even, then as in, you effectively burn your query fees in exchange for pushing the data on chain, then the single threshold, so the rebate claim threshold would be 30 GRT. But that is with the assumption that that claim costs 50,000 gas. So you need 100 of them in a batch. So if you assume each one is 30 GRT and you're 100, then yeah, the kind of break even parameters would be 30 GRT for the individual threshold and 3,000 GRT for the batch. I guess the problem then is that it would just take an inordinate amount of time to actually work up to the 3,000 GRT in the batch.
Yeah. I guess you would also, in some ways, want, like you said, their price, like the actual GRT price actually legitimately plays a role here, right? And you almost want to use your DAI value, that you already have in the agent to make a decision, to help you make that decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, personally, I would be against that. I feel like, as we've discussed, to me, this does feel like a problem that is transitory and like relating to the bootstrapping phase. So I wouldn't want to introduce additional complexity. Like, I don't know. But if so, then it would probably not be DAI, it would be ETH, right? You'd want to price the threshold in your cost basis, in the gas token.
Yeah, I need to think more on this, to be honest, personally, to really even start feeling it out. But, I'm already thinking about dropping it, right? Mine's quite high. I've set it at 250 GRT at the moment. But like, I'm big on the optics. So, I might consider dropping it to, 40 or 50. And I know that would catch a bunch of, not many, but, it would catch some allocations for me, definitely.
Cool. And I guess maybe it's worth saying, if anybody wanted to restore the prior behavior, so before batching was rolled out, you can do that basically just by setting both parameters to the same value. So if you had, whatever your threshold is, let's say 50 GRT, if you set both the individual and batch threshold to that, then the moment you have a single allocation worth 50 GRT, it will be claimed effectively in a batch of one.
Something that I would like forward, in order to make this decision, indexers maybe want to digest of their, of what's outstanding. I've been doing this in a sort of hand-made way the last few days, just trying to assess the size of the outstanding query fee allocations I have via the indexer logs. But I'm just wondering if there's a nicer way to spit that out, maybe a query that we could make via the command line interface that would allow us to spit out stats and maybe a CSV or a JSON of our outstanding receipts that need to be collected. Because you've got the logs kind of shows you the amounts against each allocation ID, but doesn't really summarize it for you.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I believe that's in a table in the database. I didn't work on that part, but it should actually be pretty easy to either, for one, right away, I can probably share that so you could query that table.
Cool.
But then we could add something to the indexer CLI, maybe just to the default status command, or as well as a separate command where you could, do indexer pending vouchers or something like that, and it would return a table summarizing your pending vouchers or your pending receipts.
That would be very useful.
That's a great idea. Could you create a quick issue? I don't think it has to be too detailed.
Yeah, sure.
Pretty obvious, but just to track that.
No problem.
Thank you.
Cool. Well, it sounds like no movement on the defaults given where we are right now, but please do share any thoughts that you have in the indexers channel. it might make sense to revise these defaults and get closer to the desired behavior. So with 8 minutes left on the clock, I wonder where to go next. Perhaps we should talk about pricing. And so I guess, if we separate the ideas of query pricing and query cost, as we were discussing earlier, and if cost is really encoded in a Ghora model, if we put all of that to the side for 1 second and talk purely about price, today most indexers are setting static cost models that effectively just set a price. Is anyone willing to share what their methodology has been in setting that value? I'll share that my methodology has been incredibly naive. Generally, I've kind of played with the number a little bit, and tried to, almost eyeball the change in gradient. So if I increase the price, what does that do to QPS versus decreasing the price? And just eyeballing a value. Obviously, that only works for a single subgraph, and so I think I probably did that a while ago for one of the subgraphs that was getting a decent amount of query volume, and then probably replicated that value elsewhere. That's definitely not where I want to be, but that's kind of how I've naively set some static prices today.
Yeah, I'm sort of in the similar boat. I do use a metric that I call rate of queries counted as okay over time, which is like rate of a rate, right? So it basically reacts to the changes I make to my models. And at the moment, I don't model per subgraph. I just haven't got into that yet. That's not true. I have done some, but generally speaking, I've been using the same price across all subgraphs. Certainly in the last couple of months, I have. But I'll use that metric, like rate of queries, to look at the acceleration, deceleration that you basically get from the reactions on the gateway side. And then I'll do really, really noddy stuff like, well, if I double my price, sometimes I'll do tuning, right? So I'll be tuning prices to see where small changes make rate changes. But then I'll also do things like, does doubling my price halve my queries? Like just simple stuff like that. And I have a logbook, and I just keep a log of everything I'm doing. I am not doing anything scientific yet. I'm only just starting to get back to all of the scripting I wrote back in mission control for QLog, so I can try and spit out some interesting information about the data that's coming out of your query nodes. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Interestingly, Jim, I feel like both of us followed an approach, maybe not a highly scientific approach, but an approach that attempted to maximize revenue.
Yep.
And yeah,
I mean, it works, Chris. It works. Look at the fees for those who are participating. It works.
Yeah, no, I hear you, but to your point earlier, which to me was a suggestion that indexers should, rather than, kind of be pricing based on revenue generation, they should be pricing based on cost basis. And, it's just interesting, right? Because like reallocation or claim or, voucher redemption costs didn't really come into that methodology for either of us.
No, because we're just tiptoeing around and feeling in the dark. I've used this so many times in the past on many graph-related calls, and it's a little bit like, well, it's not so much these days, but it was in the past very much like stumbling around in the dark, feeling around the walls, looking for a light switch, right? But that's also tied to the fact that we were dealing with simulated traffic that would react differently to the price bands that you sit in versus other indexes and where their prices are. simulating a market, right? Now we're in an actual market with real consumers. And that's when I start to think my current approach is kind of, no, it's profoundly flawed, right? And I should be thinking much more about what are my actual costs. So at least I know I'm covering them, and then I can think about price, on top of that.
Anyone want to use the last 2 minutes to just tell us how they've approached price setting? Even if it's similar to what Jim and I have talked about, it'd be good to know how people are thinking about it.
Come on, 𝗨𝘀𝗲𝗂. Come on.
Come on. Yeah,
Get on the
Pain.
stage. Pain. 𝗀𝗀. Come on, guys. I know 𝗨𝘀𝗲𝗂, you got some black magic going on. I'm watching you. You got something going on. We've talked about it before. I guess nobody wants to share any alpha, Chris.
Guess we'll have to extract their secrets another time.
Still processing,
Well, we'll end
Can
here.
you guys hear me?
Oh, yes, please, fire away.
Okay. I just wanted to kind of throw my 2 cents in because I am a smaller indexer. Sorry if my voice is jacked, but I'm a little under the weather. But as a smaller indexer as well, we kind of have to choose. We basically get, or me personally, I basically get one allocation due to gas costs being linear. And it's like the larger subgraphs with obviously the larger signal do get all the queries, and I'm kind of at least relegated to smaller subgraphs with smaller signals to stay competitive in possibly attracting delegators and keeping up APY and stuff like that. So I'm kind of shoehorned into subgraphs that don't have a lot of queries, like the bigger subgraphs with a lot of signal. So it's really hard to, when we were talking about claiming, making it smaller possibly, because not only would it mean that I would have to claim against, a negative benefit economically, but I would also have to kind of choose my subgraphs slightly differently to where I'm kind of balancing that query and indexing reward. But as of right now, at least for a smaller indexer like myself, it's just not economically viable to choose that middle ground yet.
That makes sense. I hope we can change that, especially for smaller indexers. But yeah, thanks a lot for sharing. And we will wrap there, folks. Thank you for joining us today, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Goodbye.
Thanks, bye.